The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Mandy Sheriff, Manager of Alumni Relations at AFS-USA. On behalf of the Young Ambassadors, AFS-USA's Young Alumni Leadership Group, I would like to thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, Advocacy at Home and at Large with Diana Deem. On today's webinar, we have a number of participants from across the country and all walks of the AFS experience: returnees, host families, volunteers, as well as board members, President's Circle members, and donors. Thank you all for the critical role that you play as advocates of the AFS effect every day. I would like to introduce our presenter, Diana Deem. We are so pleased to welcome Diana here today to share her expertise with you. Diana serves as Director of Congressional and Political Affairs with AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants in Washington, D.C. There, she works to advance the CPA profession's agenda and enhance its political profile with lawmakers and administration officials. She has successfully advocated on behalf of the profession with regard to multiple legislative issues and regulatory matters. She also chairs the AFS Government Relations Advisory Group of the AFS-USA Board of Directors and liaises with the bipartisan International Exchange and Study Caucus. She worked with Senators Jeff Merkley, a Democrat from Oregon, and John Boozman, a Republican from Arkansas, and Representatives Jim Himes, Democrat from Connecticut, and Steve Pearce, Republican from New Mexico, to introduce Senate and House resolutions on foreign exchange. She has also served as an AFS Host Parent and her son as an AFS Returnee. We are thrilled to have her here today to share more ways that you can help advance the cause of international exchange. Before we get started, a quick logistical note. We would like to ask that if you have questions, you ask them either in the question or chat box as they come to you, or raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted to speak. I will monitor your questions and raise them to Diana periodically. And if you raise your hand, we will unmute you at that time to speak. Diana, we're so grateful to have you here with us today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Mandy, and hi and welcome, everyone. I hope you'll find this presentation to be helpful. Mandy, if you want to go ahead and change to the very first slide that's part of our deck. The first thing I want to talk about, since what we're supposed to be talking about is advocating on behalf of AFS, is what is advocacy? I actually work as a lobbyist in Washington. Lobbyists are not ugly or awful people. We are just like you. Our job is to provide information to members of Congress, and specifically to get public support or recommend a particular cause or a policy on behalf of the organization or on behalf of the individual idea that we're trying to move forward. Another definition is related to advocacy is an activity by an individual or a group which aims to influence decisions within political, economic, and social systems and institutions. So with that basic backdrop, what does it mean to advocate in an AFS context? So we, AFS as an organization, value international exchange. All of us have had experiences related to international exchange, either as parent, host parents, or as, actual exchange students, or as volunteers. And so what we want is to have policy makers also understand and to value international exchange and the kinds of exchanges that AFS actually, works in, that whole area that AFS works in. So we'll talk more specifically about this a bit later, but AFS operates exchanges, obviously using multiple models in multiple spheres. There are private exchanges, ones that are funded specific to a participant or the participant's family, or maybe through a private grant. And then there are other exchanges that we refer to as sponsored programs. Those are paid for by the United States government and have been set aside where a part of the government's budget has been set aside for specific programs. Some of those programs that AFS actually works in are CBYX, in other words, Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange, which is an exchange between the United States Congress, or set up by the United States Congress and the German Bundestag. The Kennedy Lugar YES program, Youth Exchange and Study, is what YES stands for in that case. And that was created post 9/11 by Senators Ted Kennedy and Dick Lugar to encourage and have students from Muslim predominant countries and students from the United States go to predominant Muslim countries to enhance exchange between those two cultures specifically, and obviously multiple cultures, but anyway. And then also the National Security Language Initiative for Youth, which is actually the program that my son, Mandy mentioned my son is an AFS returnee. That's the program my son went on. And basically the State Department set this up with specific goals of teaching young people what are known as, in State Department parlance, the security languages, meaning Chinese, Arabic, Turkish, Hindi, Russian, and I think I'm forgetting one, maybe Farsi. Anyway, so both kinds of programs, private exchanges and the sponsored programs, are important for AFS, and this is where advocacy comes in. We as an organization, and I hope as a part of participating in today's webinar, you'll feel empowered to go discuss your AFS experience with policymakers, with your senators, with your representatives, with their staff, and importantly with their staff, and also to some degree, although we won't touch on this specifically, with local politicians and local school boards. You know, the United States is seeing a change in how the country as a whole views exchange and views intercultural experiences. And some schools are having obviously budget issues, and so exchange becomes difficult. So the principles you'll learn here, although like I said, we won't touch on them specifically, are ones that you can utilize as well in talking to your local officials about why they should support exchange and why your schools should sponsor exchange students and have exchange students participate, and also why American students should consider going abroad for exchange as well. So this is important, all because the United States needs to remain committed to exchanges, and AFS that supports them. We need to also make sure, in the more narrower sense, that government funding for these programs continues. So Mandy, if you want to switch to the next slide. So who are we? AFS created what's known as the Government Relations Advisory Committee a few years ago and asked me to chair that committee. Carrie Dooley, who many of you may know, works specifically in liaisoning with the State Department on getting things like J-1 visas, you know, approved, and many other things. But Carrie asked me to chair this committee a couple of years ago to do what we could to raise the awareness both within AFS of, you know, what AFS should be doing in terms of its advocacy efforts, and also to raise awareness amongst policymakers as to what AFS is. Those of us who are part of the AFS family know how important it is, know that it's been around for 70 years or more, know that you know, that it provides a tremendous experience to young people. And we just think, oh, well, everybody's got to know about AFS. Well, that's not always the case. We have a tremendous brand, but that still needs to be enhanced on a regular basis. So the folks you see listed here are all part of the AFS Government Relations Advisory Committee. And we're very happy to have all of them because they, you know, dedicate a portion of their time in terms of helping what our AFS advocacy agenda should look like. So Oops, excuse me. I don't know why my phone is ringing. Apologize for that. So let's let me see the next slide. Yes, let's switch to the next slide. Let's talk about you for a moment and what your role would be as an advocate. And you're probably doing it without even thinking about it. You know, every day that you talk to somebody about your AFS experience, every day that you mention to someone the benefits of your exchange or of your volunteering with AFS, you essentially are already being an advocate. But in the more formal sense, all of us as advocates have a couple of key things we ought to keep in mind. First and foremost, you want to educate the people you're speaking with about your issues. You want to establish a rapport with them. If you're meeting with, say, a member of Congress or that member of Congress's staff for the first time, it's important that you establish rapport and create and sustain and enhance that relationship going forward. It's important also that when you talk with them, that you have a policy objective in mind. To make a request or an ask, and we'll talk about some of those in a couple of minutes, but it's your job as an advocate to influence the actions of that person. That can be a staff member, it can be, or it can be the member of Congress, but I keep mentioning staff because oftentimes when you do call into a congressional office, a senator's office, a House member's office, you're going to reach a staff person. You're not going to reach the member of Congress. When you make an appointment, you're going to actually sit down with staff. And those people do a lot of the eyes and ears and groundwork for the members of Congress. So see that as a very positive thing if you're talking with staff. And next, I want to note that what we're doing as advocates is no different from any other relationship where you want to influence an outcome. You're there to convince the other person that you have a beneficial outcome in mind, that's something that's important to you as well as important to that person. So think about it like, you know, for instance, if you're interviewing for a job, or if you're the employer and you're interviewing a candidate, you want to make sure that there's this beneficial relationship that's going to go back and forth between both people, the hiring manager and the candidate, you know, whichever role you happen to be playing. And in this case, let's call ourselves the candidate. You're trying to convince a member of Congress to take on your issue, to support whatever it is you're asking for. And last, and let me just, this is specific to congressional offices, but don't mention in your meetings, you know, related to issues, anything related to campaigns, anything related to fundraising, or any contributions you may or may not be making to that member's re-election efforts. It's just taboo. It's not a good idea. It's officially not allowed within the Capitol complex, and presumably that's the case in district offices and state offices as well. But it's just a good thing to keep those two things separate. So with that, you know, those are some of the key items related to your role as an advocate. Let's go to the next slide. So Mandy mentioned that one of the things that I do is I have a liaison role with the International Exchange and Study Caucus. That caucus was created a little over 2 years ago by Congressman Jim Himes, a Democrat from Connecticut, who happens to be an AFS returnee. Jim went to Jordan in 1971-72, and Steve Pearce, who is a Republican from New Mexico. Now, Steve was not an exchange student, but he likes to refer to his exchange experience as one that was mandated by Uncle Sam. He was in the armed services, and he very much sees that role as an armed services member as an ambassador of the United States. So he gets exchange from a very personal level, obviously from a different kind of experience as many of us have had, but very, very seriously as well, and understands its value. Importantly, though, Mr. Pearce is running for governor of New Mexico, so he will not be returning to Congress next year, and will be on the lookout very soon for a new Republican to join Jim Himes as co-chair of the caucus. The next slide shows the current members of the caucus, and there are some others on here that are also retiring and not seeking re-election. but it gives you a sense, certainly at this stage, the number of folks in the House that have supported international exchange and study by being willing to be a member of the caucus, and that it's bipartisan. There are more Democrats than Republicans, but that's fine. The bottom line is, even with, you know, a slightly lopsided sized caucus, it does enjoy bipartisan support. One of the things I'll also really quickly mention of the caucus, you'll see that none of them are senators. In the Senate, members of the Senate typically sit on 3 to 5 committees of jurisdiction. And so caucuses are not very common. They are much more common in the House, where a member of the House typically sits on 1, maybe 2, and on the rarest of occasions, 3 committees. So in the House, members of Congress form caucuses specifically as a way to demonstrate that they have an interest in a particular area or issue or, you know, cause. And so that's why the International Exchange and Study Caucus is all House members. And that's important because when we get to the specifics of the kinds of things we're going to advocate, we're going to ask you to advocate on, we're going to ask you to talk to House members about joining the caucus. Next slide. So let me flip to the Senate for a moment and talk for a moment about something going on in both the House and the Senate, which is a resolution on international exchange and study. This resolution, which has since passed the Senate, discusses the importance of international exchange and study programs. It does not talk about any kind of government funding of those programs, but rather on a very, very broad level, talks about how international exchange and study is tremendously beneficial to the United States and to the countries where we partner and have exchanges take place. So in the Senate, both resolutions began a year ago in the springtime. In the Senate, they took Senators Jeff Merkley, who, by the way, is also an AFS returnee. He went to Ghana, and John Boozman from Arkansas introduced this resolution, and were able to get 26 members of the Senate to co-sponsor that resolution with them. 21 of the co-sponsors were Democrats, 5 of them were Republicans, including Mr. Boozman, since it was officially introduced by Mr. Merkley. And back in December, Senate Resolution 357, as it was numbered, was passed by the Senate on a voice vote, which was just tremendously positive for us as an organization and for international exchange in general. So let's flip to the next slide. We also have a House resolution, and at this point it has 14 co-sponsors, 9 Democrats and 5 Republicans. It was introduced by Jim Himes. One of those Republicans that is co-sponsored it is Steve Pearce. And we don't necessarily expect that the House Foreign Affairs Committee will actually take up this resolution during the next couple of months in the last part of the 115th Congress. But rather what we'll do is we'll ask Mr. Himes to reintroduce it next Congress. And so one of the things that we will ask of you, assuming you take on the willingness to go and meet with your House members, is to ask your member of Congress to co-sponsor this resolution if they aren't already a co-sponsor. So the next slide. Let's talk for a moment about federal budgeting. As I mentioned, we, AFS, are currently support a couple of specific exchange programs, and I mentioned the 3 that we're currently involved in: CBYX, Kennedy Lugar Yes, and NSLI. -Y is the way it's referred to. Anyway, in terms of federal budgeting, in the president's current proposed budget for 2019, the president has basically reduced all funding, essentially eliminating funding for all educational and cultural affairs programs, with the exception of the Fulbright program, which would mean those 3 programs that I've talked about would be eliminated if the president's budget were to be approved in the appropriations by Congress. Fortunately, the way that the House and the Senate like to refer to things is it's up to the president to propose and it's up to the Congress to appropriate. And so the House budget proposal calls for $646 million to go to educational and cultural affairs exchange programs. And that number actually matches up almost identically to what is currently in the budget, meaning for fiscal 2018, the current fiscal year we are in. In the Senate, they actually are calling for an increase in their appropriations bills. They call for a $690 million budget for educational and cultural affairs programs. The next slide explains the process. And as I've sort of already alluded to, the president typically submits a budget to Congress. That's usually due in March of every year. The House and the Senate pass budget resolutions. Then the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees, each of the subcommittees which have jurisdiction over each of the 12 appropriations bills, mark up or do their work related to specific appropriations bills. Then, again, this is all assuming regular order, the House and the Senate votes on each of the 12 appropriations bills, in those 2 chambers. Those 2 bills would theoretically go to conference, and the differences are worked out. Then those bills go back to the House and the Senate floors, and the president signs them. Now, anybody who follows the government budget, the Congress's budgeting process over recent years knows that what I just described doesn't typically happen. This is closer to the regular order than we are, than we would be most years, in that the House and the Senate are working on what they're calling mini buses, meaning a couple of appropriations bills are being cobbled together, and the House and the Senate are working on each, 2 or 3 appropriations bills in packages. So the House has passed several at this point. The Senate has not yet passed any, although they are hoping to take some up as early as this week, and they will continue to do so through what should be the August recess for the Senate. But Senator McConnell has decided that they'll be back to work on appropriations and on judicial nominations. So basically, the Congress has until September 30th to pass all of the appropriations and to fund the government, through, they have until September 30th to fund the government for next fiscal year. Whether or not they'll get through all 12 appropriations bills between now and September is an open question. And we can assume that if they don't, what they will do is they will pass a continuing resolution until probably sometime in December, so that the new Congress will have to take on whatever is left from those bills that weren't passed and pass the rest of the appropriations for the rest of the fiscal year, either in December or in early 2019. So I've gone through a couple of different things. This might be a good time. I don't know, Mandy, tell me if there are any questions that people have to this point.
Let's see. I see no raised hands or questions thus far, but you have a quick second to raise your hand if anyone out there has a question.
Well, we'll keep going, and then folks can continue to ask questions as we go on. So essentially at this point, I've gone through a couple of different things, related to the kinds of where we got, how we got to where we are in terms of AFS, and a couple of the different areas where we're going to ask you to go talk to your members of Congress, specifically the caucus on the House side, the House resolution having to do with international exchange and study, and the appropriations process to both the Senate and the House side. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about how you can help. And Mandy, if you'll go ahead and flip to the next slide. Let's talk about you, how you can help us. So importantly, even though Washington has a good number of lobbyists, people like me, and I represent the CPAs on the national level, it's really important to members of Congress that they know when they're talking to people like me, that they also know that there are folks back home that care about the issues that I'm discussing with them. So even even if it has to do with a CPA issue, or if it has to do with an international exchange issue when I'm advocating on behalf of AFS, it's really important that the member of Congress, whether it be a senator or a House member, knows that their constituents that, also care about whatever issue it is I'm raising. So this is where you can come in and help. How best to do that? First and foremost, obtain the AFS briefing documents. When this webinar is over, I know Mandy intends to send out an email to folks who are on this call with some information about the kinds of kinds of issues that we're talking about today, so you'll feel like you're empowered and you have the information you need to be able to have conversations with folks. Secondly, we encourage that you call or you mail or you email the DC office or the district or state office for your members of Congress on behalf of the issues that you, and presumably what you care about is what we care about. And then in addition to that, we also encourage, and these can be an either or, but what's really, really good is if you can set up a meeting either in DC or wherever you are with your local district office, with your member of Congress or their staff on the issues that you care about. A moment ago, I talked about relationships, how relationships are important. Seeing a face, knowing that there's a real person behind a request is really, really important to a member of Congress. Think about all the emails that you get every day, whether it's from, not-for-profit organizations that you may have supported in the past or ones you've never supported. Those emails are all great, and some of them you might listen to make a contribution, but you don't listen to all of them. You're much more inclined to listen to something if someone makes a personal appeal to you. And so taking that time to go meet with a member of Congress or their staff is really, really important. And then importantly, when you go in and you have a conversation with someone, ask for their support of international exchange. Do what you can to tell your story, and I'll talk about that in a moment too, but also ask for their support. Don't just leave it as, oh, well, I told them everything about what I know. Ask for their support. Ask for them to get back to you. Mandy, will you switch to the next slide? So let's take, for instance, having a meeting with a House office. So there's 3 different things. I've mentioned these already, but I'll mention them again. Ask for support for the highest funding level possible for youth exchange programs in fiscal 2019. Ask for the member to support the continuation of youth exchange programs, and specifically talk to them about how AFS is involved in CBYX, in YES, in FLEX, and in NSLI-Y. Also, ask them if they're a member of the International Exchange and Study Caucus. We'll provide you with the list. We'll provide you with these slides so you'll know who's already a caucus member. And if they're already a member, thank them for being a part of that caucus. The caucus does things from time to time where they host briefing sessions for members and staff on the kinds of things that are impacting international exchange. So being a member of that caucus has benefits to them and also provides them with the information they need to be able to talk to folks back home about the importance of international exchange and to talk to other members of Congress about international exchange. The caucus is not, I want to make this very clear, is not engaged in the appropriations process. It's outside of that. So one does not, necessarily support the other or does not necessarily correlate with the other, but in fact, both things are related to one another. And then last, also ask that the House members support Resolution 470, which is that resolution on international exchange and study. Again, if they're already a supporter, thank them, and we can get you copies. We can get you a list of the names of the 14 members that are already co-sponsors. Next slide. In the Senate, it's a little bit easier because we're only worrying about the supporting the funding levels. There isn't currently a resolution. You can thank the 26 folks that have supported it if you're from one of their states. But again, we do want to encourage you to have appointments to meet with your senators or their staff and ask for the funding levels, for youth exchange to be the highest possible. The Senate bill with the $690 million is great. The House bill is also fine. What we don't want to see happen is for exchange to get defunded the way it would under the current administration's proposal. So next slide. When's a good time to meet? Oftentimes, as you probably know, there are recesses. There are times, district work periods, where the House and the Senate are off, and folks, members of the House and the Senate are back home, specifically meant to be meeting with their constituents. The House is currently off. They left as of late last week. It says July 31st, but actually they left late last week, and they're they're back home through about Labor Day. The Senate has a shortened recess period. They're only supposed to be off next week. That may get extended if Mr. McConnell decides that there isn't a reason to keep them in, but they are always typically home on Fridays and Mondays, either one of those 2 days of the week, and also on weekends. So, and of course, district offices and Senate state offices are there with staff all of the time. So you need not work around a recess. It's just your opportunity to meet with potentially the member is greater if you do it during a recess period. Next slide, please. So I keep talking about why you should, the fact that we want you to meet with your member of Congress, or your House or your Senate member. The Congressional Management Foundation back in 2011 did a congressional staff survey, and in that survey they found that literally 97% of the time, if a member of the House or the Senate had not already arrived at a firm fixed position, that an in-person constituent meeting influenced her decision or his decision. So these meetings are, in fact, incredibly, incredibly valuable. And it's far more valuable that you meet with them than someone who is a lobbyist like me meeting with them. I obviously serve a function or I wouldn't be here in Washington. But in fact, having CPAs from back home contact members of Congress and having meetings with members of Congress is critically important. As an example, literally a week and a half ago, a couple of our folks from Georgia came up and we had meetings with 3 different Georgia members, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, on a piece of legislation that we are trying to get introduced. All of those members, we actually managed to have meetings with the members themselves. Through the cases, the member sat through the entire meeting, and one, the member only was there for a couple of minutes. But the staff were very engaged, and the members in all 3 cases were very engaged. And that was highly the case because CPAs from Georgia made the effort to come here to DC to meet with those members of Congress. Next slide. So let's talk about a couple of guidelines. Again, this is some sort of what I've covered already, but important for you. it's all about relationships, just like in your personal lives, just like in your business lives, just like in the work that you do, wherever it happens to be. Relationships take time. And your relationship with that member of Congress or with that staffer or with that office in general is really, really important. And it's something where if you skip to the last of those bullets, you can become a resource for that office and for that member. Again, from my CPA perspective, I know that there are members of Congress who pick up the phone and call their CPA back home to say, what do you think about this policy? And it's because that CPA back home has taken the time to have a relationship with that member that that person gets a phone call. And when they call the office, that office takes their phone call because they know that that person is a straight shooter. They know that that person is an honest broker. You know, use whatever term you want, but that person has credibility with them. So when you're in an office, talk about what you know. We're covering a lot of ground here, and some of these things are going to be things that you're more comfortable with than others. But talk about, you know, your story. Talk about your experience with AFS. Be informative, be concise, be clear, you know, be yourself, but also at the same time, you know, talk about the things that you know well and give information in a way that's relatable to the person that you're talking with. Know your key messages and what the asks are of that member of Congress. So, you know, really quickly, rattling them off, we want House members to become a member of the International Exchange and Study Caucus if they aren't already a member, and we want to thank those who are. We want House members to support the resolution on international exchange and study, which talks about the importance of international exchange and study. And we want to thank those who already have supported that resolution by co-sponsoring. And then last, we want House members to support the highest level possible of government sponsorship of the government-sponsored programs, the exchange programs that the State Department funds. And on the Senate side, I want that request that the senators support a high level of funding of those exchange programs that the State Department funds. Importantly, like with any meeting with anyone, obviously say thank you, and importantly, follow up with that person. Remember that if you're meeting with a staffer or you're meeting with a member of Congress, they're having multiple constituent meetings every single day. They're talking about lots of different issues every single day, and not everything can stay top of mind. You know, just like the moms out there who, you know, have 10 different things they got to remember for their kids to take care of, you know, you can't remember it all, and some things will fall through the cracks. Be sure that you follow up with copies of the information that you take along with you, that you just send a very simple email that says, let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer additional questions, all of that, so that they know that you're there and you're available for them. Next slide. In terms of a meeting, I think I've sort of started to touch on this. Senators and representatives, what this graphic is trying to show is how much knowledge do each of us have with respect to a particular issue. Senators and representatives are dealing with a whole lot of issues across a huge spectrum. And so their understanding of most issues, this isn't true of all issues, but of most issues is only so deep. Staffers, on the other hand, particularly legislative staffers here in Washington, have a particular, piece of the pie, so to speak, that their member of Congress, you know, works on. Staffers may work on tax, or they may work on health insurance, or they might, depending on how the office is staffed, may work on tax and health insurance. But they don't work on every single thing that the member needs to know. So they have the ability to go a little bit deeper on some issues. You, on the other hand, being a returnee, being a volunteer, being a host parent, essentially are that person's, that office's expert on international exchange and study. That doesn't mean you have to have all of the answers. That doesn't mean you can't say, I don't know, I will gladly follow up with you. And actually, we encourage you to do that if you're asked a question, as opposed to winging it. We don't want bad information going out there. But anyway, when you're having a meeting, keep in mind that you're the expert on this narrow topic of international exchange. So when you go into a meeting, obviously the first thing you'll want to do is introduce yourself, and possibly, I'm assuming you'll probably bring other folks with you, but if it's just you, that's fine too. Introduce yourself. Ask that staffer or ask that member of Congress, by the way, what's your experience? Do you have any experience with international exchange? And lo and behold, you might find out that that member of Congress has been a host parent, or has a son or a daughter that's been an exchange student, or maybe that staff member has been an exchange student. In fact, just recently, I was talking with Senator Angus King from Maine, and found out we had known that he or his wife, whatever, his family had been a host family before. It turns out that that his family has been a host family for students from Ghana and students from China. So, immediately there's a connection with that kind of a member, and with staffers. In terms of Steve Pearce's staff, both the legislative assistant and his LD had both done international exchange while they were in college. They had done study abroad in college. And so they felt very, very comfortable asking their boss to co-chair the caucus because they understood the value of exchange. And that was without even thinking about it from Steve's perspective, Mr. Pearce's perspective, in terms of how he viewed his experience in the military. So spend some time talking about the issues, those three things that we're asking them to support, or the one in the Senate. Tell your story. Talk about how did you get involved in AFS. If you were an exchange student, talk a little bit about what your time was like in that other country. If you're a host parent and you've hosted once or you've hosted multiple times, talk about your hosted students and what those relationships have meant to you and to your family and to your community. Keep in mind, you're the expert. You're the person who knows what this is about, and you can give it that real touchy-feely, real person impact, so that they know, so that that member of Congress knows they're not just doing this because it's dollars and cents on a page, but because it has real impact to real people. Okay, next slide. This is something I've sort of already touched on, but I'll just say it again. Keep in mind, when you go into an office or you're having a conversation with someone related to Capitol Hill, the senators or the congressman's office, that you and they have very, very similar goals, that both of you are interested in building a relationship. Capitol Hill operates best. Any member of Congress will tell you this when they feel they've been informed on the issues that they're having to vote about. Nobody wants to make decisions, just like you in your personal life. You don't want to make decisions in a vacuum. You want to know that what you are doing has, what the impacts of what you are doing has, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. You want to understand the impact of what you're doing. And it's no different when it comes to voting. Voting on specific things is a binary choice, yes or no. And oftentimes, members of Congress are forced to vote no on something they obviously would prefer to vote yes because there's a poison pill in a bill. But that said, what we want to do is we want to give every reason possible for a member of Congress to vote for international exchange, to support international exchange, to support the budget process, and the budget for the sponsored programs, and to support the resolution and to be a part of the caucus. So do what you can to build a relationship so that they'll understand why that's important. Be a resource to that office. Again, don't just have the one meeting, but plan on not only following up shortly thereafter, but periodically touching base with that office and saying, can I help you? Is there something going on related to international exchange that I might be able to help you with? And then importantly, while you're there, make the ask. Don't just provide all the information, but specifically ask for their support. Know that, again, this is where our goals of both AFSers and Hill folks, they want to do something for you. They're not there just to be there. They want to do things for their constituents. So when you make that ask, know that that staffer and that member of Congress is going to do what they can to support what it is you're asking for. Okay, next slide. How else can you help? Talk to your friends, talk to your networks, and encourage them to do the exact same thing of what we've talked about today. Share your AFS experience even more broadly. Write letters to the editor of your hometown paper, write blog posts, talk about the things that are important in AFS and why you support international exchange. And with that, let's go to questions.
Okay, we do have one question here. Someone has asked, how long should I expect to be in a meeting when I get one, and how should I structure the time of that meeting?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and I'm sorry I didn't cover that. A meeting typically, at least on the Hill, if it's here in Washington, will last anywhere from 20 minutes to 30 minutes. Typically, it's not longer than that. It would be very, very rare for it to be longer than half an hour. But in terms of structuring the time, what I would encourage you to do is to spend maybe the first 5 minutes in that sort of, especially if it's new, with a new office, in that sort of getting to know you, the introductions part. Spend the next 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes talking about the specific things that we are interested in having that person do, that member of Congress do for us. And then the last couple of minutes sort of wrapping up and asking them for questions. Fortunately, even though most members of Congress's staff tend to be quite young, they're also very smart, and they're very good at asking questions that are relevant to them. Again, make sure that you you answer what you know, and you say that you will follow up on what you don't know. My contact information is here. We can get you contact information for staff at AFS if there are things that you need to ask directly to AFS staff, or I'll connect you via email to AFS staff. But feel free to follow up with me at any point in time if you have questions about how to do a meeting, if you want to talk about a particular member of Congress, or get some additional information, related to, having that meeting and making you feel more comfortable with having that meeting with a member or with the staff.
Okay, and then I have a raised hand here, Enrico. If you'd like to speak, you're unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, we sure can.
Okay, so to build the relationship, should I talk about my experience in the country that I went to?
Yes, specifically, yes. Enrico, I think you went to Japan, is that right?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. So welcome back. I guess you've been back for about a year at this point. Yes. In terms of building the relationship, when you get there and you introduce yourself to a staff member, tell them, that you're from AFS, that you were there as an exchange student, that you participated with AFS as an exchange student to Japan. Ask them, before you get too deep into your story, have you heard from other AFSers in the past, or from other exchange program participants in the past? And see what they know. Ask them if they were an exchange student or a study abroad student themselves, and see what they say. And, just like, when you're meeting somebody for the first time, in just your personal circumstances, try to find a nexus. Try to find something where the two of you can connect with one another and make you feel more comfortable with one another.
Okay, and then I was just wondering, should I talk about like my overall experience or just a specific story?
Stories are always good, but your overall experience is going to be important to them as well. So I think what you can do is be prepared to talk about, for instance, you know, you went to Japan, you were assigned to a host family in whatever the name of the town is. There were a couple of host siblings, you know, people your age or not your age. You enrolled in high school or whatever school when you got there that AFS had arranged for you. You met folks, you know, in your community, both in your host family and outside in the community. Some of the activities that maybe you enjoyed while you were there. If there's something that's particularly poignant, something that really touched your heart about what your host family did for you, or maybe something you did for the community as a whole. You gave a presentation. Here, I'll give an example. We had an exchange student from Egypt live with us for about half the year, a couple of years back. And he came home one day from school and was asked to give a presentation about his home country, about Egypt. And I said to him, you know, Americans know a lot about Egypt, or think we know a lot about.
Hello? I can't hear you anymore, by the way.
I think we've lost Diana. So
okay.
Yeah, I think we'll give her just a quick second to rejoin.
I said, did you know that Alpha Shawi has been in continuous operation since 1772, which is longer than the United States has been a country? And he didn't know that, but he went in and told his classmates about it in the class, you know, in his presentation, you know, the next day or the next week, and that blew them away. You know, the idea that another country can have a single coffee shop that's been in continuous operation for that long was just such an eye-opener, you know, to them. So it's something that's obviously not specific to any funding or joining a caucus or anything else, but it gives you a sense of the level of depth of knowledge that you as an exchange student take to another country, and what exchange students here to the United States bring here and teach Americans about those other countries.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
We do have another here. Are there best practices for talking about AFS specifically during a meeting versus being more general about exchanges?
So you're there as a representative of AFS, and you'll remember one of the things I've said multiple times is talk about what you know. And so presumably what you know and what you're going to talk about is AFS. You can talk about how AFS is one of many exchange programs, and at least with respect to you know, the asks that we have, that will benefit all exchange programs. But I wouldn't go into any kind of detail unless you happen to know about it, you know, because you've done multiple things. Talk about the exchange programs of other organizations.
Let's see. And I guess sort of similarly, there's a question about if we were to write a letter to the editor or a blog post, how much of that should be spent talking about our own experience versus the ask, and any suggestions for how you would structure that?
I missed everything you said except how you would structure that.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Hello?
I can.
Okay. I'm glad
Hi, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I'm glad we got this far, yes, without technical difficulties. Someone's asked if they're writing a letter to the editor or a blog post, any tips on how you would structure that? As in, how much should they talk about their experience, how much they should talk about the specific organization, in this case AFS, and how much should be dedicated to a specific ask to the readers in terms of House or Senate requests?
Sure. So I don't know that we have any templates that we can share with folks, but if you read letters to the editor, they tend to be very, very, very short. So conciseness is going to be critically important. Blog posts are different. They can be as long or as short as you want them to be. And so you can follow, whatever model you think your blog post or your followers of your blog post are likely to cover. Again, I think, the basic structure, who you are, why this is important to you, what you're advocating for, and asking for something are sort of just basics, in terms of how to follow, or a decent outline in terms of what to do. Again, I'll offer, if someone has an idea and they want to, run it past me, please use my contact information, and I'll gladly read, whether it's an outline or a finished product or anything in between. I'll gladly, work with you on something you want to do. I think that's wonderful if somebody's interested in doing that.
Okay. I don't see any other questions, so one last chance for someone to raise a hand here. But we are right at 3 o'clock, so be respectful of everyone's time. See, so no more questions. Diana, I just want to thank you so much for an informative presentation, for being with us. I hope that everyone learned a great deal and feels empowered to reach out to their representatives on the national and local levels to advocate on behalf of international exchange. Of course, these skills can be helpful to you in advocating in other areas of interest as well. As we mentioned earlier, there are some materials that we will share with you that might help you in your efforts. Be on the lookout for an email from me later today with a recording of today's webinar and those resources we mentioned. Thank you again to all of you for joining us, for your continued support of AFS in the field of international exchange. And thanks especially to you, Diana, for sharing your expertise with us today. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks so much. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.